The archives of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton contain thousands of names, men and women whose lives were fractured by the cruelties of the 19th century mind. Most of these files are tragic, cataloging the slow disintegration of memory or the violent outbursts of the shell-shocked veterans who wandered home from the battlefields of the Civil War. But there is one file, marked with a red wax seal that has cracked and faded with the passing of 150 years, that tells a story unlike any other in the institution's history. It is a file that does not document a descent into madness, but rather the terrifying clarity of a mind born without the capacity for human connection. It is the record of Timothy Caldwell, a patient who was admitted in the winter of 1867 and who vanished into the humid night of July 14, 1868, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the American Midwest for generations. The official report states simply that the patient escaped custody, but the private journals of the physicians who treated him, specifically those of Dr. Samuel Harding, reveal a truth far more disturbing. They suggest that Timothy Caldwell did not merely escape. He was released into the world as a fully formed predator, an 8-year-old boy who had mastered the art of mimicking humanity while concealing a void where his soul should have been. To understand the terror that Timothy unleashed and the baffling nature of his disappearance, we must look back not to the night he vanished, but to the scorched earth of Missouri in the years immediately following the war between the states. The year was 1866, and the nation was nursing wounds that refused to heal. The landscape of Sedalia County was defined by absence. Empty chairs at dinner tables, fields left fallow for want of hands to work them, and a pervasive silence that hung over the farming communities like wood smoke. It was into this vacuum of grief that Timothy Caldwell arrived, a small figure standing on the porch of his uncle's farmhouse, clutching a canvas sack that contained everything he owned in the world. He was an orphan of the war, though not in the way most children were. His father had not fallen in glory at Gettysburg or Shiloh. He had died of a fever in a Union camp, and his mother had succumbed to consumption shortly thereafter. Timothy was passed from neighbor to neighbor until he was finally sent to live with his father's brother, Thomas Caldwell, and his wife, Sarah. To the childless couple, the arrival of the boy seemed like a singular act of divine providence, a chance to fill the hollow spaces of their lives with the laughter and energy of a child. They could not have known that they were opening their door to a calamity far worse than the loneliness they sought to cure. From the very first day, Timothy was an anomaly. In a time when rural children were expected to be seen and not heard, but also prone to the natural rebelliousness of youth, Timothy was unervingly perfect. He was a beautiful child, with hair the color of dried wheat and eyes of a pale, piercing blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He possessed a stillness that was uncommon for a boy of 8, a way of sitting perfectly motionless for hours that unnerved the farmhands and caused the local church ladies to whisper behind their fans. He did not run, he did not shout, and he did not play. When Thomas Caldwell asked him to perform a chore, Timothy did not drag his feet or complain. He simply nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and executed the task with a mechanical efficiency that bordered on the uncanny. Dr. Samuel Harding, the county physician who would eventually become the boy's primary chronicler and adversary, first encountered Timothy during a routine call to the Caldwell farm to treat Sarah for a lingering cough. Harding was a man of science in an age of superstition, a surgeon who had spent 4 years in field hospitals sawing through shattered bone and stitching torn flesh while artillery shells screamed overhead. He had seen the madness that war could inflict on the human mind, the way trauma could strip away the veneer of civilization and leave a man howling like a beast. But he had never seen anything like Timothy Caldwell. In his journal, dated September 12, 1866, Harding wrote his initial impressions of the boy. "The child sat in the corner of the parlor while I examined his aunt," Harding noted in his flowing script. "He did not fidget or look away. He watched my hands, not with the curiosity of a child wondering what the doctor is doing, but with the cold, analytical scrutiny of a student observing a dissection. When I brought out the scalpel to lance a boil on Mrs. Caldwell's neck, I saw a flicker in the boy's eyes. It was not fear, and it was not disgust. It was anticipation. This observation, though fleeting, would prove prophetic. For the first few months of his residence at the farm, The only evidence of Timothy's dark nature was found in the silent, unexplained agitation of the natural world around him. Animals, with their primal instincts unclouded by social niceties, sensed what humans could not. The Caldwell's two hunting dogs, seasoned animals who had cornered bears and fought off wolves, refused to be in the same room as the boy. If Timothy entered the kitchen, the dogs would whine and scramble for the door, their tails tucked between their legs, trembling as if the air pressure in the room had suddenly dropped. The barn cats, usually indifferent to human presence, would hiss and spit from the rafters whenever he walked beneath them. Even the livestock seemed to harbor a deep, instinctual dread of the child. Horses would roll their eyes and stamp comfortably in their stalls when he approached, and the milk cows would often kick over the pail if he stood too close during milking. Thomas and Sarah, blinded by their desire for a family and their relief at having an extra set of hands, dismissed these omens as the quirks of beasts. They told themselves that the animals were simply an use to children, or that Timothy's quiet intensity was merely the result of the hardships he had endured losing his parents. They projected their own need for normalcy onto the blank canvas of the boy's personality. When Timothy spent hours alone in the woods that bordered the property, they praised his independence and his love of nature. When he returned with his clothes spotless and his hands clean, they marveled at his fastidiousness. They did not ask what he did in the silence of the timber, or why the population of stray cats and wild rabbits in the area had begun to plummet so precipitously. They did not see the small, shallow graves that were beginning to the forest floor, or the crude, handmade tools that were being hidden away in a limestone cave a mile from the house. They saw only the son they had always wanted, a polite, helpful, quiet boy who asked for nothing and caused no trouble. It was the summer of 1867 that finally shattered the illusion, a season of suffocating heat that seemed to bake the morality right out of the earth. The first incident was dismissed as a tragedy, a heartbreaking accident of the kind that was all too common in a world without safety regulations or constant supervision. But looking back through the lens of history and the detailed notes of Dr. Harding, the death of Mary Fletcher stands out as the opening move in a game of chess played by a grandmaster against opponents who did not even realize they were playing. Mary was 5 years old, the daughter of the local blacksmith, a girl known for her bright ribbons and her infectious laugh. She was found face down in Willow Creek, a slow-moving stream that meandered through the properties of the local farmers. The water was less than 2 feet deep. The official verdict was accidental drowning. It was assumed she had slipped on a mossy stone and hit her head, or perhaps become tangled in the roots that lined the bank. But there was one detail that troubled Dr. Harding, who was called to examine the body. The girl's dress was pristine. There was no mud on her knees, no scrapes on her hands from trying to catch herself, no bruising on her shins from a slip. She looked as though she had been placed gently into the water. And standing on the bank, watching the recovery of the body with his hands clasped behind his back, was Timothy Caldwell. He was the one who had raised the alarm, running to the blacksmith shop to breathlessly report that he had seen something floating in the creek. When questioned, he claimed he had been fishing for crawdads and had stumbled upon her. He described the discovery with perfect clarity, his voice steady, his eyes dry. She looked like she was sleeping, he told the grieving mother. I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't move. It was the right thing to say, the compassionate thing to say. But Dr. Harding noticed that as the mother wept, Timothy's gaze drifted to the body of the girl, and for a split second, the corners of his mouth twitched upward. The funeral of Mary Fletcher was a somber affair, held under the weeping willows that lined the churchyard, their branches trailing in the dust as if heavy with the community's collective sorrow. The entire town of Sedalia turned out, dressed in their Sunday blacks, the men clutching their hats to their chests, the women weeping openly into lace handkerchiefs. It was a tableau of rural grief, honest and raw. In the midst of this emotional storm stood Timothy Caldwell, a small anchor of composure. He stood beside his Aunt Sarah, his head bowed at the precise angle of respectful mourning, his small hands clasped before him. To the casual observer, he was the picture of a well-behaved child overwhelmed by the gravity of the occasion. But Dr. Harding was no longer a casual observer. He positioned himself across the grave site, watching the boy through the gaps in the crowd. He noted the way Timothy would occasionally lift his head, his eyes scanning the faces of the weeping adults not with sympathy, but with a detached curiosity, like a scientist observing the reaction of a chemical compound to heat. When the first shovel of dirt hit the small wooden coffin with a hollow thud, a sound that caused Mary's mother to collapse into her husband's arms, Timothy did not flinch. He did not blink. He merely watched the woman fall, his expression placid, his breathing even. It was then that Harding realized he was not looking at a child who was brave or stoic. He was looking at a creature that was fundamentally incomplete. In the weeks that followed, the shadow over Sedalia deepened. The heat broke, replaced by a series of violent thunderstorms that turned the roads to mud and kept the farmers indoors, but the sense of unease remained. It was during this period that the livestock deaths began in earnest, escalating from the shy avoidance of the farm dogs to carnage that defied explanation. It started with the chickens on the Patterson farm, which bordered the Caldwell property. Eleanor Patterson, a practical woman not given to flights of fancy, complained to Harding during a market day that a fox was decimating her coop. "But it's a strange fox, doctor," she said, her voice lowered as if fearing she would be laughed at. "It doesn't take the birds. It doesn't eat them. It just breaks them." She described finding her prize hens lying in rows, their necks snapped with a precision that seemed impossible for a wild animal. There was no blood, no torn feathers, no sign of a struggle. Just life, extinguished instantly and methodically. Harding promised to look into it, a promise that led him to inspect the carcasses himself. What he found chilled him to the bone. The vertebrae of the birds had not been crushed by jaws. They had been dislocated by a specific, twisting force applied by hands, small, strong hands that knew exactly where the fulcrum of the bone lay. The pattern repeated itself across the valley. A calf on the Wickham farm was found entangled in a fence, strangled by a rope that had been tied with a complex knot, a knot that no cow could have created by thrashing. A goat on the Miller property was found at the bottom of a ravine, its legs shattered, with strange, circular burns on its flank that looked suspiciously like the marks of a magnifying glass held against the sun. In every instance, Timothy Caldwell had been seen in the vicinity, walking along the fence line, gathering wildflowers near the ravine, exploring the woods. And in every instance, he had a perfect alibi, usually corroborated by his doting aunt and uncle. He was a helpful boy, they said. He was just looking for berries. He was chasing butterflies. They could not see the predator living in their guest room because the predator wore the face of an angel. Then came the death of Henrik Larsson. Henrik was a giant of a man, a Norwegian immigrant who lived alone in a cabin near Devil's Bluff, a limestone escarpment that rose 40 feet above the rocky creek bed. Despite his age, Henrik was as sure-footed as a mountain goat, spending his days climbing the cliffs to harvest wild honey from the hives that clustered in the rock crevices. He was known for his caution and his intimate knowledge of the terrain. So, when his body was found broken on the rocks below the bluff on a crisp October morning, the town was bewildered. Timothy Caldwell, once again, was the one who found him. The boy claimed he had been walking to town to buy sugar for his aunt when he saw Mr. Larsson fall. He was waving his arms, Timothy told the sheriff, his eyes wide and innocent, like he was fighting something off. Then he just stepped back into the air. Dr. Harding examined the body at the scene. The neck was broken, the skull fractured, injuries consistent with the fall. But it was the secondary evidence that drew Harding's eye. Scattered around the body were hundreds of dead bees. Not just a few stragglers, but a carpet of them. And on the cliff edge above, Harding found something that the sheriff had missed. A small, burlap sack, smelling faintly of smoke and honey, hidden in a cleft of rock. Inside were the crushed remains of a honeycomb. Harding pieced the scenario together with a sickening clarity. Someone had trapped a swarm, agitated them, and then unleashed them on the old man as he navigated the most dangerous part of the climb. It was a trap, sophisticated and cruel, designed to induce panic in a man known for his calm. And once again, Timothy was the sole witness, the helpful observer who just happened to be in the right place to watch a man die. Harding knew he could not go to the sheriff with a theory about a murderous 8-year-old and a bag of bees. He needed proof. Hard, physical evidence that would stand up to the incredulity of the law. He began to stalk the boy. It was a dangerous game, hunting a hunter, but Harding felt he had no choice. He began to make excuses to visit the Caldwell farm at odd hours, watching Timothy through his field glasses from the cover of the treeline. He observed the boy's routine, noting that every afternoon, between his chores and dinner, Timothy would disappear into the dense woods that covered the northern slope of the property. He never took the same path twice, a precaution that spoke of an instinct for evasion that should not have existed in a child. On a Tuesday in early November, when Thomas and Sarah were in town for supplies and Timothy was supposedly napping, Harding made his move. He followed the faint, almost invisible trails the boy had left in the undergrowth, tracking broken twigs and disturbed leaf litter until he came to the mouth of a small limestone cave, its entrance obscured by a carefully arranged screen of dead branches. Harding pushed aside the camouflage and lit a lantern, stepping into the cool, damp dark. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing a chamber that was not a child's hideout, but a workshop of horrors. Along one wall, arranged on a flat stone like surgical instruments, were tools fashioned from farm implements, sharpened spoons, modified shears, lengths of wire fitted with wooden handles. In the center of the cave was a flat rock stained dark with old blood, but it was the back wall that stopped Harding's heart. It was covered in drawings, dozens of them, sketched in charcoal on paper stolen from Thomas's ledger. They were not the crude stick figures of a child. They were detailed anatomical studies. There was a drawing of a chicken, its skeletal structure visible, with arrows pointing to the vertebrae of the neck. There was a sketch of a dog, its jaw dissected. And there, in the center, were the human figures. A drawing of Mary Fletcher, floating in the water, her eyes open. A sketch of Henrik Larsson falling, surrounded by a cloud of angry dots. And terrifyingly, a new drawing. Incomplete but unmistakable. A sketch of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell, sleeping in their bed, with a small figure standing over them, holding a knife. Harding felt the bile rise in his throat. This was not just mischief. This was a laboratory. Timothy was not just killing. He was studying. He was refining his methods, documenting his results, and planning his next experiments. The drawings showed a progression, a learning curve. The chicken necks were practice for the complex anatomy of larger animals. The bees were a test of using environmental hazards. The drowning of Mary was a study in hypoxia. And now, the boy was preparing for the final exam, the slaughter of his guardians. Harding grabbed a handful of the drawings, stuffing them into his medical bag, his hands shaking. He had to get to town. He had to warn the sheriff. He had to get Thomas and Sarah out of that house before nightfall. As he turned to leave the cave, a shadow fell across the entrance, blocking the afternoon sun. Harding froze, the lantern light flickering in the sudden draft. Standing in the opening, silhouetted against the bright autumn sky, was Timothy. He was holding a heavy rock in one hand, his posture relaxed, his face invisible in the shadow. "You found my school," the boy said. His voice was not angry. It was not fearful. It was disappointed, like a teacher finding a student cheating on a test. "I didn't think you were smart enough to find it, Doctor. You were supposed to be the audience, not the participant." Harding reached into his coat, his hand closing around the small revolver he had begun carrying since the death of Henrik Larsson. "Step aside, Timothy," Harding said, his voice echoing in the small chamber. "It's over." Timothy laughed, a sound that was clear and melodious and utterly devoid of mirth. "Over?" he asked, taking a step into the cave, the rock heavy in his hand. "Doctor, we haven't even started the interesting part yet." The standoff in the limestone cave lasted only a moment, but to Dr. Harding, it stretched into an eternity defined by the damp chill of the earth and the weight of the Navy Colt revolver in his hand. He raised the weapon, leveling it at the chest of an 8-year-old boy. The absurdity of the image, a grown man, a war veteran, trembling before a child in short pants, was not lost on him, but neither was the very real danger radiating from the small figure blocking the light. Timothy did not flinch at the sight of the gun. He tilted his head, calculating the odds with that same terrifying arithmetic he applied to everything. He seemed to realize that while the doctor might hesitate to shoot a child, he would certainly not allow himself to be bludgeoned with a rock. With a shrug that was almost dismissive, Timothy dropped the stone. It hit the cave floor with a dull thud. "You can keep the drawings," he said, his voice light and conversational, as if he were allowing a playmate to borrow a toy. "I have them all memorized anyway." Before Harding could react, the boy turned and bolted, vanishing into the undergrowth with the speed of a feral cat. Harding scrambled out of the cave, blinking in the sudden sunlight, but the woods were silent. He didn't waste time giving chase. He knew exactly where Timothy was going. The boy had been exposed, his secret laboratory compromised. The predator's camouflage had been stripped away, and Harding knew that a cornered animal was most dangerous right before it struck. He ran for his buggy, whipping the horse into a gallop that rattled the wheels dangerously against the rutted dirt road. He had to reach Sheriff Crawford. He had to reach the farm. The timeline had accelerated. Whatever grand finale Timothy had planned for his aunt and uncle was no longer a distant hypothesis. It was an imminent necessity. Sheriff William Crawford was a man of the law, but he was also a man of his time. When Harding burst into his office, sweating and disheveled, dumping a handful of charcoal sketches onto the desk, Crawford looked at them with a mixture of confusion and pity. He saw the drawings of the chickens and the distorted figures, but he did not see proof of murder. He saw the disturbed doodlings of a war orphan, a boy who had seen too much death too young. "Doc, you're telling me a child killed Henrik Larson with a bag of bees?" Crawford asked, leaning back in his chair, his skepticism thick enough to cut with a knife. "You're telling me he drowned Mary Fletcher, and now you think he's going to murder Thomas and Sarah? The boy is knee-high to a grasshopper. He sings in the choir. Look at the drawings, William." Harding slammed his hand on the desk, pointing to the sketch of the sleeping couple. "Look at the anatomy. Look at the specific knowledge of where the arteries are. This isn't imagination. It's a plan." It took 20 minutes of fierce arguing, invoking their shared service in the war and Harding's professional reputation, to convince the sheriff to ride out to the Caldwell farm. Even then, Crawford agreed only to a welfare check, refusing to deputize men or treat it as a raid. He thought he was humoring a friend who was suffering from nervous exhaustion. He did not know he was racing toward a massacre. The sun had set by the time the buggy and the sheriff's horse turned onto the lane leading to the Caldwell homestead. The house was dark, a black silhouette against the indigo sky. There was no smoke from the chimney, no lantern light in the windows. The silence that Harding had come to dread hung heavy over the property, amplified by the wind rustling through the dry corn stalks. "Stay back," Crawford whispered, drawing his sidearm, his earlier skepticism replaced by the seasoned instinct of a soldier entering uncertain terrain. They approached the house on foot, the gravel crunching softly under their boots. The front door was unlocked. It swung open with a creak that sounded like a scream in the quiet night. Inside, the air smelled of lamp oil and something metallic, the copper scent of fresh blood. Crawford raised his lantern, the beam cutting through the darkness of the parlor. The room was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, porcelain shattered on the floor. And there, sitting in the center of the wreckage in a high-backed wooden chair, was Sarah Caldwell. She was bound with rope, her mouth gagged with a strip of cloth. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a point in the corner of the room, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to have frozen her in place. She was alive, but barely. A shallow cut ran across her forehead, bleeding into her eyes. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Harding whispered, rushing to untie Sarah. She couldn't speak, only frantically jerking her head toward the kitchen. Crawford moved toward the back of the house, his gun raised. As he pushed through the kitchen door, a blur of motion erupted from the pantry. Timothy, wielding a butcher knife with both hands, launched himself not at the armed sheriff, but at the lantern. He smashed the glass globe, plunging the room into instant, pitch blackness. In the confusion, fire from the broken lantern caught the oil-soaked floorboards. The flames roared to life, separating the men from the boy with a wall of heat and light. "He's in the cellar." Sarah screamed from the other room, her gag finally loose. He took Thomas to the cellar. The kitchen was becoming an inferno. Harding grabbed a heavy quilt from the sofa and threw it over the flames, beating a path through the fire while Crawford smashed a window to vent the smoke. They found the cellar door locked from the outside. Crawford kicked it in, the wood splintering under his boot. Down in the cool earth of the root cellar, illuminated by the flicker of the fire above, they found Thomas Caldwell. He was unconscious, slumped against a sack of potatoes, bleeding from a blow to the head. And standing over him, holding a heavy iron poker, was Timothy. The boy didn't look like a child anymore. His face was smeared with soot and blood, his teeth bared in a snarl that was pure, animalistic rage. He had failed to kill them in their sleep because Thomas had woken up. The meticulous plan had fallen apart, and now Timothy was improvising with brutal efficiency. "Put it down, son," Crawford commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. "It's over." Timothy looked at the sheriff, then at Harding, then up at the burning ceiling. He calculated the odds one last time. He dropped the poker, but he didn't surrender. He began to cry. Instantly, the snarl vanished, replaced by the sobbing, terrified face of a confused little boy. "I didn't mean to," he wailed, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his cheeks. "There was a man. A bad man came in. He hit Uncle Thomas. I was trying to help." It was a performance of such staggering audacity that for a second, just a second, Crawford lowered his gun. But Harding did not. He had seen the drawings. He had seen the eyes in the cave. "Don't listen to him," Harding shouted, rushing forward to grab the boy before he could grab another weapon. Timothy fought with the strength of a maniac, biting and clawing, kicking Harding in the shins with his heavy work boots. It took both men to subdue him, pinning the 80-pound boy to the dirt floor while the house burned above them. They dragged him out into the night, coughing and retching from the smoke, pulling the unconscious Thomas and the weeping Sarah to safety just as the kitchen roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Timothy lay on the grass, his hands bound with the sheriff's cuffs, which were far too large and had to be tied with rope to keep them on his thin wrists. He watched his home burn. He didn't look at his aunt, who was hysterical with shock. He didn't look at his uncle, who was groaning as he regained consciousness. He watched the fire. He watched the way the beams twisted in the heat, the way the sparks rose into the night sky to join the stars. And he smiled. It was a small, satisfied smile. He had lost the game, yes, but he had destroyed the board. The arrest of Timothy Caldwell presented the legal system of Missouri with a dilemma it was entirely ill-equipped to handle. There was no precedent for an 8-year-old serial killer. The law saw children under the age of 7 as incapable of forming criminal intent, and those between 7 and 14 as presumed incapable unless proven otherwise. The proof usually required a level of malice that was difficult to attribute to a prepubescent boy. But the evidence Harding provided, the journals, the drawings, the testimony of the attempted murder, was overwhelming. The town of Sedalia wanted blood. They wanted a hanging. But the state, wary of the spectacle of executing a child, intervened. The compromise was institutionalization. Timothy would not be sent to a prison, where he would likely be killed by older inmates, nor to a reform school, which he would undoubtedly terrorize. He was to be sent to the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, a fortress of red brick and iron bars designed to warehouse the mad and the dangerous. He was labeled a moral imbecile, a diagnostic term of the era used to describe those who were intellectually intact but devoid of ethical comprehension. On the train ride to the asylum, accompanied by Dr. Harding and 2 deputies, Timothy was the picture of docility. He looked out the window at the passing fields, pointing out cows and horses, asking polite questions about the steam engine. He seemed to have completely forgotten the night of the fire, or perhaps he had simply filed it away as a completed experiment. As the asylum gates closed behind him with a final, metallic clang, Dr. Harding felt a wave of relief, but also a lingering dread. He knew that stone walls could hold a body, but he wasn't sure anything could contain the mind he had glimpsed in that cave. He wrote in his journal that night, "We have locked the wolf in the sheepfold. I pray that the doctors there understand what they are dealing with. If they treat him as a child, they are dead men. If they treat him as a patient, they are fools. He is neither. He is something new, something for which we have no name." Timothy Caldwell was now patient 402, and the Missouri State Hospital was about to become his new laboratory. Life inside the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane was a cacophony of human misery, a symphony of screams, incoherent ramblings, and the clanking of chains that echoed off the cold stone walls. It was a place designed to contain chaos. Yet into this bedlam walked Timothy Caldwell, an entity of perfect, terrifying order. He was housed in the children's ward, a small, underfunded wing located in the east turret, separated from the violent adult population by heavy oak doors and a labyrinth of corridors. The staff, overworked and accustomed to the erratic outbursts of the disturbed, found Timothy to be a breath of fresh air. He was the model patient. He made his bed with military precision, the corners tucked so tightly a coin could bounce off the sheets. He helped the nurses scrub the floors, his small hands working the brush with a rhythmic intensity. He read scripture to the other children, his voice calm and soothing, lulling the weeping insomniacs to sleep. The head matron, a formidable woman named Mrs. Higgins who had run the ward with an iron fist for 20 years, called him her little angel. She would often slip him extra rations of bread or allow him to stay up past lights out to read in the common room. She saw a tragic orphan, a victim of circumstance who was misunderstood by the crude country doctor who had committed him. She did not see the way Timothy watched her belt, his eyes tracking the heavy ring of keys that jingled with every step she took. She did not see him counting the seconds it took for the night watchman to complete his rounds. She did not see that the angel was mapping the geometry of his cage. Dr. Harding, though back in Sedalia, could not let the case rest. He drove his buggy the 40 miles to Fulton once a month to meet with the asylum's director, Dr. Ambrose Thorne. Thorne was an alienist of the old school, a man who believed in phrenology and the restorative power of cold baths. He dismissed Harding's warnings with a condescending pat on the shoulder. "The boy is docile, Samuel," Thorne would say, puffing on his pipe in his leather-scented office. "He has shown no aggression, no antisocial tendencies. He speaks of his aunt and uncle with great affection. I believe your diagnosis of moral imbecility was premature. He is simply a traumatized child seeking structure." Harding would leave these meetings shaking with frustration, knowing that he was speaking a language Thorne did not understand. He tried to explain that Timothy's docility was not recovery, it was camouflage. The boy had realized that violence had gotten him captured, so he had discarded violence in favor of a more subtle tool: manipulation. The accidents within the asylum began 3 months after Timothy's arrival, in the thaw of spring 1868. They were small at first, easily attributed to the clumsiness or frailty of the patients. Old Mr. Henderson, a harmless melancholic who was allowed to wander the gardens, was found dead at the bottom of the stone stairs leading to the root cellar. It was assumed he had lost his footing in the damp air. Only Timothy, who had been sitting on a bench nearby reading a book, mentioned that he had seen Mr. Henderson chasing a butterfly near the edge. A week later, a nurse named Sarah, the same name as Timothy's aunt, scalded herself badly in the laundry room when a valve on the steam boiler suddenly opened while she was passing. She swore she hadn't touched it. The maintenance man swore the valve was stiff and couldn't turn on its own. Timothy was in the linen closet nearby, folding sheets. He rushed to get help, his face a mask of concern, earning him praise for his quick thinking. But the true nature of Timothy's treatment was revealed in his sessions with a visiting specialist from St. Louis, a Dr. Elias Vance. Vance was a pioneer in the new talk therapy, believing that even the insane could be reached through conversation. He took a special interest in Timothy, fascinated by the boy's high intelligence and articulate manner. For weeks, they sat in Vance's office, talking about the war, about farming, about God. Vance believed he was breaking through the boy's defenses. He wrote in his case notes, "Subject shows deep remorse for the fire. He claims he hears voices that tell him to do bad things, but he wants to learn to ignore them. He is begging for help." Vance was ecstatic. He believed he was curing a killer. He did not realize that Timothy was feeding him exactly what he wanted to hear, reciting a script composed of the doctor's own theories. Timothy had read the medical books on Vance's shelf while the doctor's back was turned. He knew the symptoms of auditory hallucinations. He knew the language of repentance. He was not being cured. He was learning how to be a better actor. It was late May when Dr. Harding received a letter from a terrified orderly at the asylum. The man, barely literate, scrawled a message that chilled Harding's blood. "He knows. The boy knows things he shouldn't. He told me about my sister in St. Joe. He told me she was sick. How did he know? He just smiles and says he can see it in my face. The other patients are scared of him. Document. They say he walks through the walls at night. You have to come back." Harding arrived 2 days later, demanding to see Timothy. He found the boy in the garden, planting marigolds in the rich, black soil. Timothy looked healthier, taller. The asylum food had put meat on his bones. He stood up as Harding approached, wiping the dirt from his hands on his trousers. "Hello, doctor," Timothy said, his smile dazzling in the sunlight. "Did you come to see my flowers?" Mrs. Higgins says I have a green thumb. I came to see you, Timothy, Harding said, keeping his distance. I hear you've been telling stories to the orderlies. Timothy's smile didn't waver, but the temperature in the garden seemed to drop. I don't tell stories, doctor. I just observe. People are so loud, even when they don't say a word. The orderly. He smells like cheap whiskey and guilt. He has a letter in his pocket from St. Joseph with a black seal. It doesn't take a genius to know someone died. I just filled in the blanks for him. It makes people feel special when you know their secrets. And Mr. Henderson? Harding asked, stepping closer. Did you fill in the blanks for him before he fell down the stairs? Timothy picked up a trowel, twirling it in his fingers. The metal flashed in the sun. Mr. Henderson was tired, doctor. He was very old, and he missed his wife. I just helped him find a shortcut. The admission was so casual, so veiled in euphemism, that it was barely a confession. But the look in Timothy's eyes was unmistakable. It was the same look he had given the dying chickens. The look of a scientist satisfied with a result. You can't prove it, Timothy whispered, leaning in. Dr. Thorne thinks I'm a miracle. Dr. Vance thinks I'm a breakthrough. If you tell them I pushed an old man, they'll just say you're jealous because you couldn't save me. Harding realized then that the asylum was not a prison for Timothy. It was a sanctuary. It was a place where he was fed, clothed, and protected from the law, a place filled with vulnerable victims and gullible authority figures. He was safer here than he had ever been on the farm. He had insulated himself with layers of bureaucracy and professional ego. Harding left that day defeated, knowing that a catastrophe was inevitable. He warned Dr. Thorne one last time, telling him, check the locks. Check your keys. He isn't gardening. He's digging a tunnel. Thorne laughed him out of the office. The escape, when it came, was not a violent breakout. It was a disappearing act performed with the elegance of a stage magician. The night of July 14th, 1868, was sweltering. A thunderstorm was brewing in the west, the heavy air charged with electricity. The asylum was restless. At 2 a.m., a fire broke out in the laundry storage room in the basement. It was a small fire, fueled by oily rags that had been accidentally kicked into a corner near a lantern. The alarm was raised, and chaos ensued. Staff rushed to the basement with buckets of water. The orderlies left their posts to help evacuate the smoke-filled lower wards. In the confusion, Mrs. Higgins, the head matron, felt a tug at her apron strings but paid it no mind as she directed the nurses. It wasn't until an hour later, when the fire was extinguished and the head count was taken, that the loss was discovered. Timothy Caldwell was gone. His bed was empty, the sheets folded perfectly, and missing from Mrs. Higgins' belt was the master key to the side maintenance door, a small, unobtrusive brass key that opened the gate to the delivery road. There were no witnesses. No one had seen a small boy slipping through the smoke-filled corridors. He had simply vaporized. A search of his room revealed the final piece of his terrifying puzzle. Under his mattress, they found a journal. It was not written in English, but in a crude cipher, symbols and shapes that looked like nonsense. It took Dr. Vance weeks to crack it. When he did, he wept. It was a list of names, staff members, patients, doctors. Next to each name was a weakness, a fear, or a habit. Nurse Mary fears spiders. Orderly John drinks on duty. Dr. Thorne vanity. And at the bottom of the list, written in plain English, was a single name, Dr. Samuel Harding. The manhunt that followed Timothy Caldwell's escape was the largest in the history of Callaway County, a desperate scouring of the earth that involved 3 sheriffs, a posse of 50 armed men, and a pack of bloodhounds brought in by train from St. Louis. They combed the dense forests that hugged the Missouri River, dragging the bottoms of creeks, and searching every abandoned barn and hayloft within a 30-mile radius. The public demand for his capture was feverish, fueled by the sensational headlines that screamed from the front pages of the local gazettes. The boy monster loose, and the child with the devil's eyes. Mothers locked their doors and kept their children inside, terrified that the polite, blonde-haired boy would appear on their porch asking for a glass of water. But despite the fervor, despite the dogs and the guns, and the eyes watching every shadow, the earth seemed to have swallowed Timothy whole. The dogs tracked his scent to the riverbank, to a spot where a small skiff had been stolen from a local fisherman, and there the trail vanished into the murky, swirling currents of the Missouri. For Dr. Samuel Harding, The news of the escape was not a surprise, but a death sentence. He received the telegram at his office in Sedalia on a rainy Tuesday morning, the paper trembling in his hands as he read the simple, devastating line. Patient 402 missing. Key stolen. Journal recovered. Harding did not join the posse. He did not ride out to help the sheriff. Instead, he went to the hardware store and bought 3 heavy iron bolts, which he installed on the front and back doors of his small cottage. He bought a new box of ammunition for his Navy Colt and cleared the brush away from his windows to eliminate hiding spots. He knew what the others did not. Timothy was not running away. He was hunting. The list in the journal had been a promise. The years that followed were defined by a silence that was more terrifying than any noise. There were no sightings of Timothy in Sedalia. No small footprints were found in the garden. No livestock was found tortured in the fields. It was as if the boy had simply ceased to exist. But Dr. Harding knew better. He spent his evenings poring over newspapers from across the Midwest, searching for the telltale signs of Timothy's work. He became a ghost in his own life, a recluse who jumped at the sound of a tree branch scraping against the roof. He was looking for patterns in the chaos of the world, and slowly, terrifyingly, he began to find them. In 1871, 3 years after the escape, a wealthy widow in Davenport, Iowa, died in a house fire along with her new ward, a charming orphan boy she had taken in a few months prior. The fire was ruled an accident, caused by a tipped lamp, but the newspaper report mentioned that the boy had been the only one to escape, found weeping in the yard, clutching the widow's jewelry box to save it for her. He disappeared the next day. In 1874, a general store owner in Omaha was found dead at the bottom of his own elevator shaft. His new apprentice, a polite teenager who was good with figures, had vanished, along with the contents of the safe. The descriptions of the boy were always vague, quiet, polite, pale eyes, but the methodology was as distinct as a fingerprint. It was the exploitation of trust, the weaponization of innocence. Harding realized that Timothy was doing exactly what he had predicted. He was growing up. He was no longer the child who needed to hide in caves or rely on the pity of adults. He was becoming a young man, blending into the transient population of the expanding frontier. He was evolving. The clumsy experiments of the farm were over. He was now a master craftsman of death, moving from town to town, shedding identities like snake skin. He was becoming the perfect predator, one who didn't just kill, but who extracted resources, money, shelter, trust, before disposing of the host. By 1880, Dr. Harding's health had begun to fail. The stress of his vigil, combined with a heart weakened by age, had left him frail and gray. He rarely left his house, his medical practice long since abandoned. His neighbors whispered that the old doctor had gone mad, that he was haunted by ghosts of the war. They didn't know he was haunted by a ghost of the future. In his final years, Harding devoted himself to compiling a comprehensive dossier on Timothy, a warning to a world that had forgotten the name of the boy from Sedalia. He wrote furiously, filling notebook after notebook with his theories on psychopathy, arguing that there were human beings born without the moral compass that defined the species. He was describing a monster that modern psychology would not fully categorize for another century. Dr. Samuel Harding died in his sleep on November 12, 1891. He was found by the milkman, lying in his bed with his Navy Colt resting on the nightstand, fully loaded. Under his pillow was his final journal, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of anxious handling. The last entry, written in a shaky hand just hours before his heart finally gave out, offered a chilling final perspective on the case of Timothy Caldwell. "I am dying," Harding wrote. The ink blotched where his hand had rested. "And with me dies the only man who knows the truth. The world believes Timothy Caldwell drowned in the river in 1868. They believe the nightmare ended. But I know he is out there. He would be 33 years old now. A man. He could be a banker, a lawyer, a father. He could be your neighbor. He has had 20 years to perfect his mask. He understands us better than we understand ourselves because he has been studying us from the outside, like a biologist studying a colony of ants. We assume that evil looks like a monster, that it has fangs and claws. But the true horror of Timothy was that he looked like us. He looked like our sons. And now, he looks like a man you might pass on the street and tip your hat to. I fear for the future. I fear that he is not just one aberration, but the first of a new breed. A predator adapted for the modern world, invisible and unstoppable. If you are reading this, do not look for a boy. Look for the man who smiles too perfectly. Look for the man whose eyes never change. And pray that he does not look back at you. The house in Sedalia was sold, the doctor's possessions auctioned off. The dossier on Timothy Caldwell was boxed up and donated to the State Historical Society, where it sat gathering dust in a basement archive, mislabeled and ignored. The legend of the boy monster faded into folklore, a spooky story told to frighten children into behaving. The Caldwell farm was eventually razed, the land tilled over to make way for a new highway. The cave was sealed by a landslide in the 1920s, burying the crude tools and the blood-stained rock forever. But the question remains, hanging in the air like the smoke from that long-ago fire. What happened to Timothy? Did he die in the river? Or did he walk out of the water and into the history books, an anonymous architect of tragedy? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America saw a rise in unexplained disappearances, unsolved murders, and accidental deaths of wealthy eccentrics. Was the boy from Sedalia responsible for some of them? Did he marry? Did he have children, passing on his cold, pale eyes and his icy void of a soul to a new generation? We like to think that monsters are caught, that justice is inevitable. But history is filled with empty spaces, with crimes that have no culprit and darkness that has no name. Timothy Caldwell vanished because he was better at the game than we were. He realized that the best place to hide was in plain sight, wrapped in the camouflage of a normal life. So, tonight, as you lock your doors and check your windows, ask yourself, do you really know the people around you? Do you know the history of the quiet man down the street? Or are you, like Dr. Harding, simply waiting for the day when the mask slips, and you see the 8-year-old boy staring back at you from the eyes of a stranger? This is the legacy of the Sedalia horror. It is not just a story about a killer child. It is a reminder that we are surrounded by strangers, and that sometimes, the most terrifying thing in the world is the face we trust the most. The file in Fulton remains, the wax seal broken, the pages yellowed. It waits for someone to connect the dots, to realize that the story didn't end in 1868. It just changed chapters. And somewhere, perhaps even in your own family tree, there is a gap, a silence, a missing record where Timothy Caldwell wrote his name in invisible ink.